Oh, hi! You got me enjoying a nice red, white, and berry. Smirnoff? The communists are coming.
Comic Tropes. Comic Tropes.
Hello! Welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. You know, the late 1940s through the 50s was actually a pretty difficult time for a lot of comic book publishers. There was a huge fear of communism, and that fear extended to nearly every facet of American life, including comic books. We're going to look at one today that was printed in 1947. It was shortly after World War II, and the big fear we had here was communism. All sorts of people were afraid that communism would infiltrate and take over and fundamentally alter America. So this comic was put together by a Catholic guild in Minnesota. It's called Is This Tomorrow? And it's a comic book about communism taking over America instantly. Just trying to scare little kids with how easy this would be. This kind of fear-mongering extended all the way into like the early 50s when Dr. Frederick Wertham published Seduction of the Innocent, saying that comic books made kids into, just terrible, terrible people. We had, of course, like the McCarthyism era, and we had comic book publishers literally being afraid that they were about to get censored or banned and teaming up to self-impose the comics code, which limited all sorts of stuff from comics. It put EC Comics right out of business because horror was kaput. In that way, it's a little insidious, and there's plenty more history there to explore. But today, let's look at this singular, terrible piece of propaganda that would basically be laughable to you and I as adults, but to little kids, it was designed to scare them. The story kicks off showing the Capitol covered in communist flags and a guy with an American flag being beaten up. And that doesn't follow through to any kind of logical sense. I mean, if we think about it, just because a different political party would be controlling America, it's still the same country. Why would we change our nation's flag? If we apply that same logic, we're capitalists now. Do we have AT&T and General Electric logos stitched all over our flag? No, of course not. But everything in this comic is designed to scare kids. Every time we come across that, I'm going to take a swig of this Smirnoff red, white, and berry. Actually, now that I think of it, every single page is designed to be scary, so I'll just keep drinking throughout the whole story. We cut to a farm to lay out an important plot point for the story. America, apparently all of America, is going through a bad drought and crops are withering. And this is our first indication that this comic book was clearly written by a bunch of old dudes, because the way they spelled drought, it's spelled drouth. Technically, this is grammatically correct. It's an acceptable way to spell and pronounce the word, but it's pretty old English. It's mostly used in poetry, and it was pretty much phased out by this point in time, that kind of pronunciation. Hello, children. Welcome to this Wednesday of February. Are we having a drought? The story then has foreign communist leaders appoint their top communist man in America, named Jones, begin a plan to turn America communist, which he says he can do within a year with two simple steps. 1, create a crisis and seize power. And 2, take control of all the food while there is a drought. I like that Jones is like 2 simple steps to taking over America. Step 1, take over America. Ah, that's why you're our top man, Jones. We hear from a man named Brown who is working on the plan. Their first step is to get a popular representative to endorse their false organization designed to oppose intolerance. They then have radio announcers talk up the good of the program. Brown tells this to the group and talks about how they've been training these left-wing people in TV and radio to follow their party line. Exactly what the party line isn't actually spelled out specifically in this comic. Instead, they're just trying to get the reader not to trust the news. And you know what? I will say that people should be skeptical of the news. They should take things with a grain of salt, do their own research, be critical. But the idea of just outright not trusting major news sources is not healthy. We don't have people going like, that news is full of baloney. I get all my news at the church, not from reporters. Brown then goes full Alex Jones conspiracy crazy by saying he has their people join clubs, only to mention being wary of Jews, which causes the man next to him in this example to begin screaming that he won't work with Jews. Brown also says that somehow their people in Hollywood have worked to make doctors not care whether people live or die. It's funny to look back at this and go, if anything, Hollywood movies have probably become much more cynical today than they were back in the 40s, and yet we don't have doctors just going, this is too much work, let that patient die on the table. Because, we have things like laws, and people have things like morals, a conscience. Another member of this shadowy cabal, Smith, says that he's had communists infiltrate the military and all sorts of labor jobs, so that they're all ready to strike at a moment's notice. An unnamed man says he'll report this to Moscow. So this part of the story is absolutely bonkers, because it says that people that believe in this certain philosophy are in turn loyal to a foreign government, which is actually two very different things. First of all, we only had about 50,000 registered people to the Communist Party in 1947 in America. Something like that. It's pretty darn small. And second, they've conflated in this story the idea that just because you believe in this communist belief, you're loyal to Russia. I mean, that'd be like saying if you read manga, that means that you want to obey the laws of Japan. The Communist Party then launches the plan the very next day, instantly coordinating all their labor to strike. Then, when the unions begin negotiating with the businesses, apparently that same day, they simply tell their communist members to draw out the meetings so long that everyone that isn't a communist gets bored and goes home, at which point they control the negotiating power. One labor representative literally says, "I now move we implement the same policies as Soviet Russia." As though that isn't a completely insane thing to say in a meeting. Even if everybody in the union voted this communist way, that doesn't mean that the business has to accept that deal. If two sides can't negotiate in good faith, a mediator is installed. We have laws for this kind of stuff. The communists in this story are so efficient and take over so quickly, they're like the Borg from Star Trek. It's absolutely ridiculous to you and I as critically thinking adults, but to kids, it's probably plausible. So aiming this at kids, I would argue that this comic is actually evil in its intent. At this point, members of the Communist Party somehow get permission to give speeches to both the striking laborers and a bunch of farmers, riling them up, saying that the other is the reason for work stalling. And the story treats both laborers and farmers as idiots, because in the next panel, they're fighting in the streets. You can tell the farmers apart because they all wear straw hats. And then these people break into a rich man's house and hang him. The story says lynchings became common. This comic is literally telling the same type of story as the Purge movies, except I'd argue that the Purge movies are told with more nuance and finesse, which is saying something because while the Purge movies are fun, they're not exactly clever. Over the next few pages, society just collapses instantly. People complain about Catholics, Jews, and one guy orders a woman to accuse a black man, well, he calls him a Negro, of stealing. And shortly, everyone is fighting while buildings burn. This is the Purge. And at this point, I have to point out that a lot of this stuff actually does happen in our modern society, but we don't collapse into rioting chaos. Various religions are constantly attacked, although it is a little bit dated how they treat Catholics as a persecuted minority. But that's okay, that does still happen, I suppose. Definitely the idea of black people getting accused of doing nothing. I mean, we hear those stories all the time. It was just the other week that two guys had the police called on them for just sitting in a Starbucks. But that doesn't mean that society just collapses and riots. That's not what happens. If these communists really wanted to drive people crazy, they'd take away their entertainment. If people took away our video games, then maybe we'd start getting angry and punching each other. Things get even more over the top as people begin shooting police in broad daylight. Smith yells at a bunch of people on the street, and everyone decides the best thing to do right now is to strike, bringing all industry to a standstill. Because who needs to earn money? Jones visits the Speaker of the House, who apparently has already been recruited, and tells him they're about to get rid of the President and Vice President. Conveniently, the two ride in a parade in an open car. So a man tosses a grenade onto them. How are we supposed to take any of this seriously? This book was not intended to be parody or satire. They're being serious. They think that the Communist Party has already done all this stuff before the story even began in terms of recruiting important government officials, Labor Party people. I mean, that's the story that I would actually like to read, is how they convinced all these people to join their cause. But with the logic of this comic book, the communists probably just threw out some Hostess fruit pies to trick everybody. The story is essentially told at this point because the communist Speaker of the House is appointed president, following the designated chain of command. But the comic keeps going and getting sillier. The Speaker has the government somehow gather all the food in the country. Jones says the problem is America still has too much food despite the drought, which invalidates the problem we were told made all this possible. Jones proposes they burn the food. Technically, thanks to a spelling error, Jones says, "We'll blame the fire on the anti-communists." Yeah, they have the ability to burn all the food in the entire country. That'd be a pretty sweet bonfire. The government blows up all the food, leading to supposed riots in supermarkets. You know, those riots where you still put on your Sunday best and run away with a bunch of carrots, yelling to everyone within earshot that you have it. Meanwhile, the government rounds up anyone who is anti-communist, which is presumably at least 75% of the country. President Klein gets nervous that rioters will come for them. So Jones orders Klein to put Jones in control, and apparently he does that off-panel. Jones orders that only the most loyal communists should get food, and we see an old man being told he can't have food because he's too old to produce any worthwhile labor. Apparently in this story, we're supposed to believe that the average American is actually a total asshole who's just willing to go along for the ride and intentionally and willfully let an old person starve to death. This book actually gets the fundamental principle of communism wrong. Nobody's sharing anything. Nothing is communal. The community part of communism. So it's just absurd. I mean, I don't think communism works, but are we supposed to believe that in Russia, for instance, they're constantly letting old people starve to death in the middle of the streets? That just doesn't seem sustainable or plausible. This comic, I swear to God, it's presenting a dystopian future more sci-fi than something like Mad Max or Logan's Run. Jones then calls all the military leaders to a meeting and just has 2 or 3 guys enter and murder them with machine guns. He then says to replace them with loyal men. You know, when this story said that the police were being killed by rioters, I felt bad for the police. But if the military leaders are this dumb to follow for such a ploy, maybe they deserve to be wiped out. I don't know why the comic didn't simply say, and all the military leaders were convinced to join the Communist Party before the story even started. You know, like they did with all the labor workers and the government officials. Just say that that also happened with the military leaders. And speaking of things like military and stuff, all of a sudden now I'm thinking, what about foreign governments? That's never addressed in this story. You'd think that our neighbors to the north, Canada, might have a say in things. You'd think that key allies like England would be like, oh, America's murdering people in the streets. Maybe it's time for, the UN to say something. Never brought up. Jones continues getting away with whatever he wants, eliminating Congress and preventing newspapers from getting paper to print on. Jones has gone full Emperor from Star Wars, although I do think it's a bit of an oversight to wait this long until he starts curtailing the freedom of the press. Just the idea that the Constitution could fall apart this easily. Ay, ay, ay. On page 27, we're introduced to our first good guy. He's a Catholic priest, since this comic was printed by Catholics. He says to be nice, so someone blows up his church with dynamite. Then, on the next page, he's taken by some men in suits to the woods and shot dead. So much for the resistance. Jones has the phones taken over by the government and somehow blocks foreign radio broadcasts. That one's a thinker. We're shown a classroom where the teacher animatedly yells at calm children that he defies them to prove God exists. Those kids don't really seem to care either way. The story gets especially repetitive at this point, with Jones shutting down institution after institution. He next decides to nationalize universities, and even the colorist working on the comic has gotten bored because he switches Jones from a red smoking jacket to a blue blazer in mid-conversation. Once Jones has finished firing professors and having the dean dragged away, he speaks to the students, apparently in the middle of a football field, and orders them to burn books, including the Bible. You can tell this story was written by Catholics because the only good people in this story are explicitly said to be Catholic. It's a total self-insert, a real Mary Sue type of situation. And also, the climax of the story isn't when communists take over the government, it's when they finally decide to burn the Bible. Time for another hero to rise up. A man tries to shoot Jones, but Jones takes him out by hurling a book at him. The man is captured and reveals he's Catholic. Jones orders that anyone that owns a gun should be shot with it. After that, we have to slog through several pages of Jones shutting down all churches. Jones says that now is the time to end strikes and have people go back to work. To coerce people to go back to work, he rations food and they only get a small amount. The fact that the strikes have been going on this entire time implies that this story happens within a few weeks at most. Jones is so efficient, he's going to make Dr. Doom and Lex Luthor jealous. Now we see starving men kill a horse, and a woman and baby just die on a park bench. The unions cave and people go back to work, but complain about working overtime for little pay. I love that this is presented as a problem unique to communism, as though all of us haven't dealt with work situations where we feel overworked and underpaid. The only people that would fall for this are kids, and that's why it's aimed at them. Workers are shown being whipped for taking a vacation day. Men are rounded up and sent to labor camps. Apparently, just about everyone goes along with this. Then Jones holds an election with only one party, Communism, to vote for. At this point, the story has gone past the point of being redundant and has just become misery porn. We see that people that try to vote independently are murdered. The government seizes control of banks. Soldiers tell farmers that they have to give 80% of their crops to the government. A little brat walks into the police station to rat out his parents for owning a radio and religious paraphernalia. But that is what happens when you don't get your kid a Nintendo. Jones orders a big celebration for himself and has a heart attack. Finally, the story concludes with Brown saying he'll take over now. Is This Tomorrow would have you believe that 2 years after defeating the Nazis, Americans would be ready to burn books. It would have you believe that no one stands up to Jones, not even successful businesses. Instead, everyone is manipulated like victims in a Saw movie. Is This Tomorrow is easily one of the worst comic books I've ever read. It's because it's just fear-mongering, but not even just fear-mongering. It's fear-mongering aimed at young readers. That was the idea behind this. These weren't pamphlets that were distributed, at church or something like that to everybody. This was aimed at kids. That's why they chose comic books. So I would say this comic book is flat out evil. I've never come across a book this bad. The only stuff I can say about it that works is, honestly, the artwork is pretty good. The artwork is good. The lettering and the coloring is average at best. Not very good at all. But the art's pretty good. I have no idea who did it. Nobody's credited. Probably nobody wanted to take credit for this. This was probably just work for hire for at least the artists. Anyway, not my favorite. Let's move on to something more fun. All right, folks, I got two great pieces of fan art this week. We have, for this must be something like the 5th time, Ken Ives with a very fun piece. Thank you so much, Ken. And we have this piece by Prajwal Jayaraj. He's from India, and he's obviously created a piece based on Transmetropolitan. I'll definitely have to review some work by Warren Ellis at some point. That's definitely something I'd love to talk about. By the way, as a prop, my fiance handed me these new Oreo fireworks. Didn't really have an explicit use for them. But what's fun is the cream actually has Pop Rocks in them. I'm gonna get my teeth dirty. Okay, so if you have fan art, send it to comictropes@gmail.com. If you want to include something like your website, portfolio, social media link, send me that too. I'll show everything we have, and then I draw a random winner for a gachapon. Since it's a 50-50 chance, I will use this coin. I'll flip a coin. Heads will be Ken Ives. Tails will be Prajwal. And that is heads. So, Ken Ives, you have won a gachapon. Let's reach in, see what you got. A Disney one. I think that this expands into Belle from Beauty and the Beast. So, that's pretty cool. If you don't want it, Ken, maybe you have somebody in your family or friends or neighbors that will. I will send this your way. All right, everybody, as always, thank you all for watching, and until next time, keep reading comics.